Hey freshmen, it's Miss Matthews again. This video is for chapter 2 of Mice and Men. Remember, the whole idea here is that you're reading along as I am reading, and when I'm stopping and explaining things or pointing out details that you should notice, you should be annotating that information in your actual book or on some post-it notes on the pages. Remember, there's different ways you can annotate, different reasons you can annotate: annotating to summarize, annotating to react, annotating to connect, and annotating to analyze. So let's get right to it. The bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls, there were small square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets, and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles: soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves in little vials, combs, and from nails on the box sides a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. So just like chapter 1, this opens with a description of the scenery, except now instead of being outdoors in that sort of peaceful clearing by the pond, we're now in a bunkhouse. So bunkhouse is the living quarters for men who work on the ranch. And you can see this bunkhouse is made for 8 people. There's 8 beds, but only 5 of them are made up, which means there's sort of 3 job openings, and we know at least Lenny and George are coming to take 2 of those. And then there's descriptions of the kind of belongings the men have. And what you should notice here is it's not much. It's just a few things, enough stuff to fit in a little apple box that's nailed to the wall above their bunk. And there's you see signs of life, like the stove in the corner to keep things warm at night, and the table in the center with playing cards on it. And instead of chairs, they sit on boxes. So it's homey enough, but it's certainly not a 5-star hotel. Certainly not lush accommodations. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised. The door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans, and he carried a big push broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round, stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell's this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. What the hell kind of bed you giving us anyway? I don't want no pants rabbits." The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella, and as clean a guy as you want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "Then how come he got graybacks?" George was working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," said the swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals, he'd peel his boiled potatoes, and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was. Clean. Used to dress up on Sundays even when he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even, and then set in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What did you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, he just quit, the way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, 'Give me my time one night,' the way any guy would." So this old guy is showing George and Lenny where they're going to be staying, And the first thing he says is that the boss was mad that they didn't show up last night. The boss was mad that they couldn't go out into the fields and work today. okay? And then as he's showing George and Lenny their beds, George spots this little yellow can on the apple box shelf above his bunk, and it says it positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. So it's like an insect repellent or pesticide or something for like bed bugs and gross stuff like that. So George is like, what kind of bed is this? Like, what are you trying to sell me here? I don't want no pants rabbits. And the old guy is like, no. The guy who used to, sleep in that bunk, he was a real clean guy, and he'd put that stuff around just to be sure, even if there was no bugs. So, sort of a germaphobe maybe, and he's just trying to reassure George and Lenny that it's a clean place. But we also learn a little bit more, again, about the kind of lives these rancher men live, these migrant workers. Because the old guy says that he just quit the way a guy will. Says it was the food, he just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food, just says, give me my time, that means pay me what I'm owed. And just said, give me my time one night, the way any guy would. So this is very typical, that guys just sort of up and quit, they collect their money, and they move on to the next job. George lifted his tick and looked underneath it, so he's lifting up the mattress and kind of inspecting the bed. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately, Lenny got up and did the same thing with his bed. Finally, George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and a bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, I guess the boss will be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eating breakfast and says, where the hell's them new men? And he give the stable buck hell, too. So a stable buck is the person who works with the horses. George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. Give the stable buck hell, he asked. Sure, you see, the stable buck's black. Black, huh? Yeah, nice fella, too. Got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss gives him hell when he's mad, but the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room. What kind of a guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, know what he done Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right in here and says, drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did, a whole gallon? Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let Crooks come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after Crooks. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so Crooks got him. If he could have used his feet, Smitty says he would have killed Crooks. The guy said on account of Crooks got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in a relish of memory. After that, the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. So first of all, the fact that the boss was mad and gave the stable buck hell, took it out on the stable buck, and the fact that we learned the stable buck is the only black person on the ranch, and you can see the language used on the page that I'm not going to say, tells us a lot about that boss, right? That he is going to be the big boss man, but when he's mad, he's going to sort of beat up on the one black person on the ranch. And then the old guy, or George, asks, well, what's the boss like? And the old guy's like, oh, he's a pretty nice guy. He brought us this gallon of whiskey on Christmas. That was great. We had a good old time. And then he talks about how the good time involved letting Crooks, the one black man, the stable buck, into the bunkhouse and then like making him fight Smitty, this guy Smitty. That was their entertainment on Christmas, okay? And again, it's peppered with that racial slur that the old guy is using very casually. That doesn't make it okay. Like we talked about in our discussion in class, unfortunately, it was a more commonly used word back in the 30s. And you can see that the old man uses it very casually. Like he's not expecting that to offend anybody or to offend George. So, keeping in mind that sort of racial disparity that existed at the time. Lenny was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, that's like a cowboy hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. So this guy's dressed different than the other guys, right? Big belt buckle and high-heeled cowboy boots and spurs. The old swamper looked quickly at him and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. "Them guys just come," he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. So this guy's the boss. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. "I wrote Murray and Reddy I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips?" George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. "It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. It says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning." George looked down at his feet. "Bus driver give us a bum steer," he said. "We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning." The boss squinted his eyes. "Well, I had to send out the grain teams, 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner." He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. "What's your name?" "George Milton." "And what's yours?" George said, "His name's Lenny Small." The names were entered into the book. "Let's see, this is the 20th, noon the 20th. He closed the book. "Where you boys been working?" Up around Weed," said George. "You too?" To Lenny. "Yeah, him too," said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. "He ain't much of a talker, is he?" No, he ain't, but he's sure a hell of a good worker, strong as a bull." Lenny smiled to himself. "Strong as a bull," he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, "Listen, Small." Lenny raised his head. "What can you do?" In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. "He can do anything you tell him," said George. "He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try." The boss turned on George. "Then why you don't let him answer? What you trying to put over?" George broke in loudly. "Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale." The boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted, one eye nearly closed. "Say, what you sellin'?" "Huh?" I said, "What stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay away from him?" "No, of course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out?" "Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I'd just like to know what your interest is." George said, "He's my cousin. I told this old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right, just ain't bright. But he can do anything you tell him." The boss turned half away. "Well, God knows he don't need any brains to buck barley bags. But don't you try to put nothing over, Milton. I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit and weed?" "Job was done," said George promptly. "What kind of job?" We was digging a cesspool." "All right, but don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go on out with Slim's team." "Slim?" "Yeah, big, tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner." He turned abruptly and went to the door. But before he went out, he turned and looked for a long moment at the 2 men. All right, so the boss comes in, and just like George's plan, George is doing all the talking, right? He said before in the last chapter he didn't want Lenny to wreck their chances of keeping this job by talking before the boss could see him work. And the boss catches on to this pretty quick. He's like, "Wait a minute, why don't you let that guy talk? Are you taking advantage of him? Are you taking his money?" And it's really telling on page 22 when the boss says, "Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy." This is unusual. The fact that these two travel together, that George clearly looks out for Lenny, and so that makes the boss suspicious. He thinks maybe George is taking Lenny's pay or something like that. So George makes up a story and says that Lenny is his cousin. He's not. They're actually not related. Okay? And he makes up the story about Lenny getting kicked in the head to explain his disability. And we're going to find out in a minute that's not actually true either. Okay, but what it's done now is the boss has got their eye on him. And that's the last thing George wanted. And he tells him to go out with the grain teams, to go out and work after dinner, and that they'll be a part of Slim's team. So we'll meet Slim later. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. "So you wasn't going to say a word. You was going to leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking. Damn near lost us the job." Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I gotta talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we gotta be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, said George viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. And that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door, and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing listening? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. So George is definitely suspicious of people. He doesn't like the idea that maybe this guy was standing outside the door listening to their conversation. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you was saying. A guy on a ranch don't never listen, nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and sit down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss, he asked. Pretty good. Seemed all right. He's a nice fellow, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him, right? At that moment, a young man came into the bunkhouse, a thin young man with a brown face with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man? He asked. The swamper said, he was just here a minute ago, Curly. Went over the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new men, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George says, suppose he don't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he's got to talk when he's spoken to. What the hell are you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly at Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. All right, so now we got a new character comes in. His name's Curly, and he's the boss's son, right? He says he's looking for my old man. And you can tell he's the boss's son. He acts with a sort of cocky arrogance. He's dressed more like the boss, wearing the high-heeled boots. And he definitely spots Lenny instantly and gets into a fighting stance, essentially. On page 25, when it describes how his arms bent at the elbows, his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. He's like taking a boxing position. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Calculating means like scheming, and pugnacious means like ready for a fight. Okay, so he seems to target Lenny, and then especially when George won't let him talk, he sort of doubles up on it, right? So now George and Lenny, they got the boss watching him, and this boss's son seems to have some sort of beef. It's important to note, Lenny's not a big guy. A thin young man with a brown face. Okay, he's kind of a little guy, We're going to hear a little bit more about that in a second. George watched him out, and then he turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight, and he's handy. So he's a boxer. Saying he's handy means he's a good fighter. And in fact, he does fight in a ring. He's a lightweight. He's a little guy, but he can fight. Well, let him be handy, said George. He don't have to take after Lenny. Lenny didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered, well, tell you what, Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at him because he ain't a big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy. Sure, said George. I've seen plenty of tough little guys, but this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't handy, but this Curly punk is going to get hurt if he messes around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy and licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick on somebody his own size, and maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. Right? So we hear a little more about, and the old guy, whose name is Candy, we haven't heard that yet, but the old guy says, well, he's, those little guys who are kind of mad at big guys because they're not big. And then he sort of muses that it's not really fair, because if Curly, as a little guy, picks a fight with a big guy and beats him, then everybody's like, wow, Curly, so impressive. But if Curly picks a fight with a big guy and the big guy kicks his butt, then everybody's like, oh, big guy, you should pick on someone your own size, and then maybe they gang up on the big guy. And he says, Curly's kind of not giving anybody a chance. He's not a real fair fighter. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, you better watch out for Lenny. Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'd slough me. He just don't give a damn. Won't ever get canned because his old man's the boss, right? Curly can never get fired because his dad's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me. I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me like he's worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple weeks ago. Wife lives over in the boss's house. Seems like Curly's cockier ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's showing off for his wife. The swamper warmed to the gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah, I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? What the hell for? Well, I'll tell you what. Curly says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. George studied the cards absorbedly. That's a dirty thing to tell around, he said. The old man was reassured. He had drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and he spoke more confidently. Wait till you see Curly's wife. George cut the cards again and put out a solitaire lay, slowly and deliberately. Purty? He asked casually. Yeah, purty, but... George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah, married 2 weeks and got the eye? Maybe that's why Curly's pants is full of ants. I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerkline Skinner, hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on a grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly never seen it. And I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like we was going to have fun. The swamper stood up from his box. Know what I think? George did not answer. Well, I think Curly's married a tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty done that. Okay, so the old guy kind of warms up, feels like he can trust George and gossip a little because they've already talked about Curly. And so they start talking about Curly's wife and how she's pretty, but she's got the eye. Got the eye means she looks at other men. Okay, that her gaze seems to wander. And the old man says that she's got the eye for Slim and that she's given Carlson the eye and all of this. He doesn't say she's actually done anything. He just says that her eyes wander a little bit. You know what I think? I think he married a tart. Now, a tart is a derogatory term for a promiscuous woman, for a slut. So he's called her a slut, right? So we have some real sort of assumptions being made on the part of the old man about who this woman is. Okay. The old man moved toward the door, and his ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta be setting out the wash basins for the guys. The teams will be in before long. You guys gonna buck barley? Yeah. You won't tell Curly nothing I said? Hell no. Well, you look over her, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out the door into the brilliant sunshine. Okay, and the last thing we want to notice that I didn't mention earlier is that the old guy's got this old dog that follows him around that's like partially blind and has a hard time walking and stuff. But the old guy says he used to be a really good sheepdog in his day. George laid down his cards thoughtfully, turned his piles of 3. He built 4 clubs on his ace pile. The sun was square on the floor now, and the flies whipped through it like sparks. A sound of jingling harness and the croak of heavy-laden axles sounded from outside. From the distance came a clear call, "Stable Buck! Ooh, Stable Buck!" And where the hell is that goddamn Stable Buck? So the teams are coming back from the field, and you can hear the horses and the wagons and the men calling. George stared at his solitaire lay, then he flounced the cards together and turned around to Lenny. Lenny was lying down on the bunk watching him. "Look, Lenny, this here ain't no setup. I'm scared. You're going to have trouble with that Curly guy. I seen that kind before. He was kind of feeling you out. He figures he's got you scared, and he's going to take a sock at you the first chance he gets." Lenny's eyes were frightened. "I don't want no trouble," he said plaintively. "Don't let him sock me, George." George got up, went over to Lenny's bunk, and sat down on it. "I hate that kind of bastard," he said. "I've seen plenty of them. Like the old guy says, Curly don't take no chances. He always wins." He thought for a moment. "If he tangles with you, Lenny, we're going to get the can. Don't make no mistake about that. He's the boss's son. Look, Lenny, you try to keep away from him, will you? Don't never speak to him. If he comes in here, you move clear to the other side of the room. Will you do that, Lenny?" "I don't want no trouble," Lenny mourned. "I never done nothing to him." "Well, that won't do you no good if Curly wants to plug himself up for a fighter. Just don't have nothing to do with him. Will you remember?" "Sure, George. I ain't gonna say a word." The sound of the approaching grain teams was loud. The sound of the approaching grain teams was louder. Thud of big hooves on hard ground, drag of brakes, and the jingle of trace chains. Men were calling back and forth from the teams. George, sitting on the bunk beside Lenny, frowned as he thought. Lenny asked timidly, "You ain't mad, George?" "I ain't mad at you. I'm mad at this here Curly bastard. I hope we was going to get a little stake together, maybe $100. His tone grew decisive. "You keep away from Curly, Lenny." "Sure I will, George. I won't say a word." "Don't let him pull you in." "But if the son of a bitch socks you, let him have it." "Let him have what, George?" Never mind. I'll tell you when. I hate that kind of guy. "Look, Lenny, if you get in any kind of trouble, you remember what I told you to do." Lenny raised up on his elbow, his face contorted with thought. Then his eyes moved sadly to George's face. "If I get in any trouble, you ain't going to let me tend the rabbits." "That's not what I meant. You remember where we slept last night? Down by the river?" "Yeah, I remember. Oh, sure, I remember. I go there and I hide in the brush." "Hide till I come for you. Don't let nobody see you. Hide in the brush by the river. Say that over. Hide in the brush by the river, down in the brush by the river. If you get in trouble. If I get in trouble." A brake screeched outside. A call came, "Stable Buck. Oh, Stable Buck." George said, "Say it over to yourself, Lenny, so you won't forget." Both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full rouged lips and wide-spaced eyes heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, those are types of shoes, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. "I'm looking for Curly," she said. Her voice had a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her and then back. "He was in here a minute ago, but he went." "Oh, She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the door frame so that her body was thrown forward. You're the new fellas that just come in, ain't you? Yeah. Lenny's eyes moved down her body, and though she did not seem to be looking at Lenny, she bridled a little. She looked at her fingernails. Sometimes Curly's in here, she explained. George said brusquely, well, he ain't now. If he ain't, I guess I better look someplace else, she said playfully. Lenny watched her, fascinated. George said, if I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him. She smiled archly and twisted her body. Nobody can't blame a person for looking, she said. There were footsteps behind her going by. She turned her head. Hi, Slim, she said. Slim's voice came through the door. Hi, good looking. I'm trying to find Curly, Slim. Well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going in your house. She was suddenly apprehensive. Bye, boys, she called in the bunkhouse, and she hurried away. George looked around at Lenny. Jesus, what a tramp, he said. So that's what Curly picks for a wife? She's purty, said Lenny defensively. Yeah, and she's sure hiding it. Curly got his work ahead of him. Bet she'd clear out for $20. Lenny still stared at the doorway where she had been. Gosh, she was purty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by an ear and shook him. Listen to me, you crazy bastard, he said fiercely. Don't you even take a look at that bitch. I don't care what she says and what she does. I seen him poison before, but I never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be. Lenny tried to disengage his ear. I never done nothing, George. No, you never. But when she was standing in the doorway showing her legs, you wasn't looking the other way either. I never meant no harm, George. Honest, I never. Well, you keep away from her because she's a rat trap if I ever seen one. You let Curly take the rap. He let himself in for it. Glove full of Vaseline, George said disgustedly. And I bet he's eating raw eggs and right into the patent medicine houses. Okay, so let's talk about Curly's wife. So first of all, we also hear this dirty thing about Curly keeps one glove with a handful of Vaseline, so he got a soft hand for his wife. That's dirty. He's talking about sex, right? And he's telling people about it. And then she shows up, and as Steinbeck describes her, she's pretty. She's young. She's described as a girl. She's wearing makeup, a lot of makeup. She's got fingernail polish on. Her hair is curled. She's got a pretty dress and little red shoes, okay? That's not typically how one would dress on a ranch, right? So she's dressed up. She obviously cares about her appearance. She knows she's pretty. Even describing the way she stands as if she's aware that men look at her, okay? And of course, Lenny doesn't know any better. He's just like, gee, she's pretty, okay? And she says she's looking for Curly, and they say she's not here, and then she says hi to Slim, and then she hurries off, okay? And you know, George is not very nice. He calls her a bitch. He calls her poison. He calls her jailbait. He says she's a rat trap, right? I mean, that's a lot to say about a person after you've just met them. But George is very suspicious, right? He's been told this information by the old man that she might be a tart, that she got the eye. And then when she shows up and she is pretty and she's sort of dressed more provocatively than one would normally be, he makes all these assumptions about what she wants and what she's here to do. But she'd clear out for $20. She would leave Curly for $20. Okay? And then he says, you let Curly be the sucker who gets hurt by her. Don't he sees the way Lenny's looking at her. He's like, don't even think about it. Stay away from her. I don't care if she's pretty. She's trouble. Okay, so now they got the boss watching them. We know Curly doesn't like big guys. And now Curly's got this wife who might be trouble as well. Lenny cried out suddenly. I don't like this place, George. This ain't no good place. I want to get out of here. We got to keep it till we get a stake. He says, we got to stay till we make some money. We can't help it, Lenny. We'll get out just as soon as we can. I don't like it no better than you do. He went back to the table and set out a new solitaire hand. No, I don't like it. He said, for 2 bits, I'd shove out of here. For a quarter, 2 bits is a quarter. If we can just get a few dollars in the poke, we'll shove off and go up the American River and pan gold. We can make maybe a couple of dollars a day there, and we might hit a pocket. Lenny leaned eagerly towards him. Let's go, George. Let's get out of here. It's mean here. We gotta stay, said George shortly. Shut up now. The guys will be coming in. From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. Maybe we ought to wash up, he said. But we ain't done nothing to get dirty. A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm while he combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he'd finished combing his hair, he moved into the room, and he moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. He was a jerkline skinner, the prince of the ranch, capable of driving 10, 16, even 20 mules with a single line to the leaders. He was capable of killing a fly on a wheeler's butt with a bullwhip without touching the mule. There was a gravity in his manner and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. This was Slim, the jerkline skinner. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or 50. His ear heard more than was said to him, and his slow speech had overtones not of thought, but of understanding beyond thought. His hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their action as those of a temple dancer. Wow, who's this guy? All right, so this guy comes in, and he is described with such respect by Steinbeck. Steinbeck outwardly tells us how we should feel about this guy, right? He says he moved with majesty, only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen, people who were true artists of their craft. He was the jerkline skinner. Again, that's the guy who drives the team of mules that pulls the farm machines. He was the prince of the ranch, and he's really good at his job. He could drive 10, 16, even 20 mules with one line to the leaders. He could kill a fly on the butt of a mule without even touching the mule. He could whip his whip and kill a fly without even touching the mule, okay? He was serious. There was gravity in his manner. People listened when he talked. He had authority on every subject. He could have been 35 or 50, all right? He has a sort of understanding that it seems like other people don't. He could understand beyond thought. And his hands are large and lean and strong, but they're also delicate. So this is a very interesting description of a man who we are supposed to respect and find an authority figure. He smoothed out his crushed hat, creased it in the middle, and put it on. He looked kindly at the two in the bunkhouse. That's the first person to look kindly at them. "It's brighter than a bitch outside," he said gently. "Can't hardly see nothing in here. You the new guys?" "Just come," said George. "Gonna buck barley?" "That's what the boss says." Slim sat down on a box across the table from George. He studied the solitaire hand that was upside down to him. "Hope you get on my team," he said. His voice was very gentle. "I got a pair of punks on my team that don't know a barley bag from a blue ball. You guys ever bucked any barley?" "Hell yes," said George. "I ain't nothing to scream about, but that big bastard there can put up more grain alone than most pears can." Lenny, who'd been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacently at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over the table and snapped the corner of a loose card. "You guys travel around together?" His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. "Sure," said George. "We kind of look after each other." He indicated Lenny with his thumb. "He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I've knew him for a long time." Slim looked through George and beyond him. "Ain't many guys travel around together," he mused. "I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other." "It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know," said George. A powerful big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped water from the scrubbing and dousing. "Hi, Slim," he said, and then he stopped and stared at George and Lenny. "These guys just come," said Slim by way of introduction. "Glad to meet you," the big man said. "My name's Carlson." "I'm George Milton. This here's Lenny Small." "Glad to meet you," Carlson said again. "He ain't very small." He chuckled softly at his joke. "Ain't small at all," he repeated. "Meant to ask you, Slim, how's your bitch? I seen she wasn't under your wagon this morning." Now that means dog. Okay, he's saying, how is your dog? That is an actual term for a female dog. "She slang her pups last night," said Slim. 9 of them. I drowned 4 of them right off. She couldn't feed that many." "You got 5 left, huh?" "Yeah, 5. I kept the biggest." "What kind of dogs do you think they're going to be?" "I don't know," said Slim. "Some kind of shepherds, I guess. That's the most kind of seen around here when she was in heat." Carlson went on. "Got 5 pups, huh? Gonna keep all of them?" "I don't know. Have to keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk." Carlson said thoughtfully, "Well, look here, Slim. I've been thinking. That dog of Candy's is so goddamn old he can't hardly walk. Stinks like hell, too. Every time he comes in the bunkhouse, I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, damn near blind, can't eat. Candy feeds him milk. He can't chew nothing else." Okay, so we hear about some of the dogs on the ranch. First of all, we heard about Slim's dog who had puppies last night, but she had 9 of them. And often when a dog has too large a litter, they can't care for the younger ones. So Slim drowned 4 of them. And that sounds very, very cruel, but it's much crueler to let puppies sort of starve to death. Okay, so he's got 5 left. He's not sure what he's going to do with them, all of this. And Carlson's suggestion is, Candy, that's the old guy, he's got that old dog. It's miserable. It can't even eat. It's blind. Let's get Candy to put his dog out of his misery, shoot him, and then we can give him one of those puppies that he can raise up. George had been staring intently at Slim. Suddenly a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first, and then faster and faster until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. "There she goes," said Carlson. Outside, there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. So that's the dinner bell being rung, the triangle. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. "You guys better come on while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple minutes." Carlson stepped back to let Slim precede him, and then the 2 of them went out the door. Lenny was watching George excitedly. George rumpled his cards into a messy pile. "Yeah," George said. "I heard him, Lenny. I'll ask him." "A brown and white one," Lenny cried excitedly. "Come on, let's get dinner. I don't know whether he got a brown and white one." Lenny didn't move from his bunk. "You ask him right away, George, so he won't kill no more of them." "Sure, come on now. Get up on your feet." Lenny rolled off his bunk and stood up. The 2 of them started for the door. Just as they reached it, Curly bounced in. Okay, so what's Lenny excited about? Puppies. There's puppies. I want a puppy. George, you said I could have a puppy. Ask him so I can have a puppy. I want a brown and white one, right? So he's all excited at the prospect of a puppy. And then Curly shows up. "You seen a girl around here?" he demanded angrily. George said coldly, "About a half hour ago, maybe." "Well, what the hell was she doing?" George stood still, watching the angry little man. He said insultingly, "She said she was looking for you." Curly seemed really to see George for the first time. His eyes flashed over George, took in his height, measured his reach, looked at his trim middle. Which way she go?" he demanded at last. So right there, Curly sizes up George. He's like, "Could I fight this guy?" He kind of to see how big he is, how long his arms are. He looks pretty fit. "I don't know," said George. "I didn't watch her go." Curly scowled at him and, turning, hurried out the door. George said, "Lenny, I'm scared I'm going to tangle with that bastard myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ. Come on, there won't be a damn thing left to eat." They went out the door. The sunshine lay in a thin line under the window. From a distance, there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment, the ancient dog walked lamely in through the open door. He gazed about with mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed, then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curly popped into the doorway again and stood looking into the room. The dog raised his head, but when Curly jerked out, the grizzled head sank to the floor again. Okay. So, again, George does not like Curly. He's like, "Dang, I might fight him myself." They go off to lunch, or to dinner rather, and then the old dog, just to kind of finish the scene, comes in and blind, sniffs, and lies down, and we see Curly popping his head back in, still looking for his wife somewhere. All right, so there's chapter 2.